She had everything a woman could want on paper. A beautiful penthouse overlooking the city, designer clothes in every closet, a platinum credit card with no limit. But behind closed doors, the fairy tale was a nightmare. Her name was Victoria Sterling, and she was married to one of the most powerful men in the country. Or so everyone thought. What nobody knew was that her husband, Marcus Ashford, was slowly destroying her piece by piece. And when she finally revealed who she really was, his entire world collapsed in seconds. Hi there, nice to meet you. My name is Kay, and I'm the mind behind this channel. And today, I want to thank all of you for watching and supporting these stories. Your comments, your shares, your love for these videos means everything to me. And if you want your comment to be featured in the next video, here's what you need to do. Answer this question for me right now. Do you believe that true love can survive a terrible secret, or does trust break the moment something is hidden? Comment down below. I'm reading every single comment, and your answer might just appear in the next video. And who knows, maybe it inspires the next story I tell. Now, let's dive into today's story. A woman who had everything but lost her peace. And a man who thought he could break anyone until he met his match. Chapter 1. The Beautiful Prison. She had learned to smile without moving her eyes. It was a skill she'd perfected over 5 years of marriage. The smile reached her lips, curled them upward in a way that looked genuine to anyone watching. But her eyes remained cold, distant, watching from behind the cage of her perfect life. The penthouse was silent, except for the sound of her breathing and the hum of the air conditioning. Victoria stood in front of the full-length mirror in her walk-in closet, examining the damage. Bruises in various stages of healing decorated her upper arm where Marcus had grabbed her last night. She'd worn a long-sleeved dress to cover them. She always wore long sleeves now, even in summer, even when it made no sense. The purple was fading to a sickly yellow-green. Tomorrow it would be easier to cover with makeup. She'd become an expert at makeup, not the kind that made you look beautiful, the kind that made you look like you'd never been touched at all. Her phone buzzed on the marble vanity. A text from Marcus, "Be ready by 7. The Hendersons are hosting a dinner party, and don't embarrass me like last time." She didn't know what last time meant. She'd sat quietly at the last dinner party, smiled, listened, made sure his glass was never empty, but apparently something she did or didn't do had embarrassed him. That's how it worked now. He found reasons. Some nights it was because she'd spoken too much. Other nights it was because she hadn't spoken enough. Some nights it was because he'd had a bad day at the office, and she was the easiest target for his rage. She'd stopped trying to predict it. She'd stopped trying to prevent it. She'd just learned to endure it. The clock showed 4:47 p.m. 2 hours and 13 minutes to transform herself into the version of Victoria that Marcus wanted the world to see. The version that was happy. Content. Lucky to be married to such a successful, powerful man. She started by doing her makeup with the precision of someone performing surgery. Foundation to even out her skin tone and hide the exhaustion that had become permanent. Concealer under the eyes. Contour to sharpen her cheekbones because apparently, the weight she'd lost made her face look gaunt and sad. Marcus had said that, "Victoria, you're getting too skinny. You look like you're wasting away. Try to eat more." But then when she gained 2 pounds, he'd grabbed her by the chin and said, "You're getting fat. Do you want to embarrass me by looking like a whale next to my colleagues?" She existed in a constant state of being wrong. Lipstick came next. A deep crimson red that matched the dress she'd chosen. The dress was expensive Italian silk, the kind of thing that made other women envious at parties. That was the point. Marcus liked when other men looked at her. It made him feel powerful, like he owned something so desirable that every man in the room wanted to steal it from him. But heaven forbid she ever smile at any of them. Heaven forbid she ever have a conversation that lasted more than 2 minutes. Once, she'd spoken to another man, a colleague of Marcus's, about architecture. Just architecture. Nothing personal, nothing flirtatious. Just a genuine discussion about the design of the building they were in. Marcus had been quiet all night, so quiet it was worse than if he'd screamed. When they got home, he'd broken a glass against the wall and told her she was a flirt, a slut, embarrassing him in front of his friends. The dress fit perfectly. It always did. She had a stylist now, a woman named Derek who Marcus had hired to ensure that Victoria always looked impeccable. Derek came to the penthouse twice a week and selected outfits. did fittings, made sure everything was camera-ready. Because sometimes the society pages ran photos from these events, and Marcus wanted to look good in those photos. His reflection was always perfect in them. Smiling, confident, with his arm around Victoria like she was a prized possession. Which in his mind she was. The intercom buzzed at 6:55 p.m. Marcus hated waiting. He'd text her at 6:50 asking if she was ready, knowing full well she wouldn't be. It was another game, another way to demonstrate his power over her. To show that she existed at his pleasure, on his timeline, at his command. She took the elevator down to the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The doorman held the door open for her. He looked at her with pity sometimes, she thought, but it was probably her imagination. Nobody looked too closely, nobody wanted to see. The car was waiting outside, Marcus behind the wheel of his silver Mercedes. He looked immaculate as always. Expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled, his watch worth more than most people's homes. When she got in the car, he didn't greet her. Instead, he looked her up and down with an expression that was impossible to read. "You look acceptable," he finally said. The word acceptable landed like a punch. Not beautiful, not lovely. Acceptable, like she just barely met the minimum requirements. "Thank you," she said automatically. The words came out with the right tone. Grateful, deferential, obedient. This was the voice she'd learned to use around him. Not too confident, not too weak. The voice of someone who knew their place. "Where did you go today?" Marcus asked as he pulled into traffic. "Nowhere. I stayed home," she answered. He glanced at her, and she saw his hand tighten on the steering wheel. "You didn't go shopping?" "No," she said. "I didn't need anything." "Everyone needs something, Victoria. You're so boring sometimes. It's like living with a ghost." The criticism was casual, delivered like an observation about the weather. But she felt it settle into her chest like a stone. She'd spent years of her life before Marcus. Years where she had a career, friends, a family. Years where she laughed and talked and took up space in the world. But that version of herself seemed to belong to someone else now. She couldn't even remember what she used to talk about, what she used to laugh at. It was like someone had taken those memories and locked them away in a place she couldn't access. The Hendersons' house was a marvel of modern architecture. Glass and steel and open spaces designed to impress. The kind of house that was beautiful but cold. Like everything Marcus was attracted to. They parked in the circular driveway among rows of luxury cars. Before they got out, Marcus reached over and adjusted her hair slightly. Not because it looked wrong, but to demonstrate that he could touch her whenever he wanted. That she was his to adjust, to rearrange, to own. "Be charming tonight," he said. "But not too charming. I don't want you drawing attention." She nodded. The instruction was contradictory, but she was used to that. Be perfect, but not too perfect. Be present, but not too present. Exist in the exact space he designated for her, never stepping outside the invisible boundaries. The party was already in full swing when they arrived. Men in expensive suits clustered in groups, talking about markets and mergers. Women in beautiful dresses circulated with wine glasses, their laughter carefully calibrated to be heard but not threatening. Victoria took a glass of wine from a passing waiter and positioned herself beside Marcus, her hand resting on his arm in the way he preferred. It showed possession. It told the world that she belonged to him. A man Victoria didn't recognize approached them. He was older, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested someone used to authority. Marcus's entire body changed when he saw him. The tension left his shoulders. He smiled with something that was almost genuine. "William Henderson. Good to see you, sir." Marcus's hand was suddenly protective on the small of Victoria's back. William looked at Victoria with interest. "This must be your wife. The one you're always telling us about." "Yes, Victoria, this is William Henderson. He owns the Henderson Group, very successful company." Marcus's voice had taken on a tone of pride. As if he was bragging about a painting or a sculpture rather than introducing his wife. "And you are?" William extended his hand to Victoria. She took it, shook it firmly, and introduced herself with the name she'd been using for 5 years. Just Victoria, nothing before that. Nothing that hinted at the person she used to be. "That's a lovely name," William said, "and you seem remarkably composed. Most women get nervous at these events." "I'm just here to support my husband," Victoria said, and she meant it. Every word was true. She was there to support him, to serve him, to exist in whatever capacity he needed her to exist in. "That's wonderful," William said. "You know, I've always believed that the strongest marriages are the ones where the wife understands her place." Victoria felt Marcus's hand press slightly harder against her back. A reminder, a warning. She'd understood her place a long time ago. A sound interrupted their conversation. Someone called out across the room, and William excused himself. Marcus guided her to another part of the room, away from the main action. His hand never left her body, it was always somewhere. Her back, her arm, her elbow, a constant reminder that she was with him, that she was his. Hours passed in a blur of small talk and false smiles. Victoria had perfected the art of being invisible. She could stand in a room full of people and somehow take up no space at all. She could listen to conversations without really hearing them. She could exist without existing. It was a useful skill, a survival skill. As the evening wore on, she noticed Marcus drinking more than usual. His laugh became louder, his movements more aggressive. She recognized the signs. By the time they got home, he'd be in a mood. And when he was in a mood, there was rarely a good outcome. The car ride home was silent. She watched the city pass by the window, the lights blurring together. When they pulled into the underground parking of the penthouse, Marcus cut the engine and turned to face her. "You know what the problem with you is, Victoria?" He didn't wait for her to answer. "The problem is that you're boring. You're a beautiful trophy, but you have nothing inside. No passion, no fire, just obedience." The words were delivered calmly, almost conversationally, as if he was discussing the weather instead of tearing apart her soul. She'd learned not to defend herself. Defending herself only made things worse. So she sat there, hands in her lap, and waited for whatever came next. "Get out," he said. She got out of the car. They took the elevator up to the penthouse in silence. When they got inside, he poured himself a drink and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city. Victoria stood where he'd left her, just inside the door, waiting. "Do you know what I could have done?" he asked without turning around. "No, sir," she said. "I could have married literally anyone. Any woman in the world would have been lucky to marry me, but I chose you. And this is how you repay me, by being boring and lifeless." "I'm sorry," she said, those words. She'd said them 1,000 times. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." They didn't mean anything anymore. She'd become empty, hollowed out by apologies that changed nothing. He turned to face her finally. His expression was cold, calculating, and in that moment she made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. Not another day, not another hour. She couldn't let him break her into smaller and smaller pieces until there was nothing left. That night, while Marcus slept, Victoria got out of bed carefully. She moved through the dark penthouse like a ghost, packing a bag with clothes and her important documents. She thought about leaving a note. She thought about trying to explain, but she knew there was no explanation he would accept. She knew that if she tried to leave through normal channels, he would use his power and his money to make sure she never saw the outside world again. He'd already threatened it. "If you ever try to leave me," he'd said once, "I'll make sure you regret it. I have friends everywhere. I have lawyers. You'll lose everything, including your family." So she did something desperate. She drove to the only place she thought might be safe, the military compound on the edge of the city, and when the guards asked her who she was, she told them the truth. A truth she'd been hiding for 5 years, a truth that Marcus never knew. A truth that would change everything. "I'm Victoria Sterling, and my father is General William Sterling." Chapter 2. The secrets she kept. The guards at the military compound recognized the name immediately. General Sterling was one of the highest-ranking military officials in the country. A man of immense power and authority. A man who commanded respect not through threats, but through genuine competence and decades of service. And his daughter had just walked through the gates at 3 in the morning in a car that cost more than most people's salaries. The guards escorted her inside. Quickly, with a reverence that suggested they understood something serious was happening. General Sterling's private office was accessible through a secure elevator. Victoria had been here before, years ago, when she was still trying to maintain some connection to her family, before Marcus had isolated her completely. Before he'd convinced her that her family didn't care about her anymore, that they'd rejected her for choosing love over duty. All lies, but she'd believed them. When her father walked out of his office, his expression shifted from surprise to something darker. something that looked like pure fury. "Victoria." His voice was authoritative, commanding, but underneath it was concern, real concern, the kind that came from a parent who'd been worried sick about their child. "What happened?" he asked, and Victoria felt something crack open inside her. 5 years of holding it together. 5 years of being strong, of enduring, of surviving. It all came pouring out. And as she told her father everything, the pain of every bruise, the cruelty of every word, the isolation of every year, she saw his face transform. She saw the man she'd known her whole life disappear and be replaced by something else entirely. Something dangerous. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. Marcus woke up to find Victoria gone. He called her cell phone. She didn't answer. He called her friends. They hadn't heard from her. He checked the security cameras and saw her leaving in the car at 3:47 a.m. At first he was angry, furious. He'd been betrayed by the one person he controlled completely, but the anger quickly turned to something else. Fear. Because he suddenly realized that Victoria knew things. Intimate things about his business, about his dealings, about how he operated. And if she was angry, if she was willing to talk, then everything he'd built could come crashing down. He hired private investigators. He tried to track her location, but Victoria had disappeared completely. It was like she'd vanished off the face of the earth. For 3 days, Marcus was in a state of panic. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't think about anything except the fact that his wife was gone and she knew enough to ruin him. On the 4th day, he received a call. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, authoritative. "This is General William Sterling. You are married to my daughter, Victoria, and we need to talk." Marcus felt his blood run cold. General Sterling, the most powerful military official in the country. The one person whose authority superseded almost everyone else's. And Victoria was his daughter. How was that possible? How had Marcus not known? He'd investigated Victoria before marrying her. Or at least, he'd thought he had. He'd paid people to dig into her background. But apparently, his investigators had been incompetent because they'd completely missed the fact that his wife was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country. The meeting was set for the following day. Marcus had to come alone to a secure location, the same military compound where Victoria had sought refuge. When he arrived, he was escorted to a conference room. And there, at the head of a long table, sat General Sterling. He was older than Marcus had expected, with silver hair and an expression that suggested he'd seen things that made normal concerns seem trivial. Beside him sat Victoria. She looked different, stronger. Her eyes were clear, focused, and completely devoid of the fear that usually characterized her expression. "You know," General Sterling began without preamble, "I've had a very interesting conversation with my daughter. She's told me some things that deeply concern me. I'm not sure what she's told you," but Marcus started. "But nothing," the general interrupted. "She's told me that you've physically abused her, emotionally abused her, isolated her from her family, controlled her movements, controlled her finances, all while making her believe that she was the problem, that she was boring, unworthy, a burden." Marcus felt his face flush. "That's not," he started again. The general held up his hand. "You need to understand something. I've spent my entire career dealing with people who think they can take what they want. People who think that power comes from control, from fear, from domination. Those people usually end up dead or in prison. And right now, I'm deciding which one happens to you." Marcus's mouth went dry. "You can't," he started. "I can and I will," the general said simply. "I have lawyers who have already begun the process of pressing charges. Assault, battery, coercive control, financial abuse, marital rape. The list goes on. Your assets are being frozen as we speak. Your company is being investigated for fraudulent practices. And everyone you've ever worked with is being contacted and informed of what kind of man you really are. It's over, everything." Marcus looked at Victoria, expecting something. Mercy, maybe, but her expression was completely unmoved. She'd moved on already. She was no longer the woman who'd served him. She was someone else entirely. Someone who'd found her strength again. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's world collapsed exactly as the general had promised. His business associates abandoned him. His lawyers could only do so much. The charges mounted. Victoria's testimony was detailed and devastating. She spoke calmly about every incident. Every bruise, every cruel word, every time he'd broken something precious just to watch her cry. The media had a field day. The headlines were brutal. Wealthy businessman Marcus Ashford arrested for spousal abuse. CEO of Ashford Industries faces multiple felonies. These headlines played on every news channel, in every newspaper. The man who'd spent his life building an image of success and power was now known throughout the country as an abuser. A criminal. Someone who'd used his money and power to control and hurt the people closest to him. His friends disappeared. His business collapsed. His reputation was destroyed. And through it all, Victoria stood beside her father. She gave interviews. She spoke about her experience. She used her platform to help other women who were in similar situations. She became an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. And slowly she healed. She reconnected with her family. She found new passions. She remembered what it felt like to laugh, really laugh. Not the controlled, measured laughter she'd perfected for Marcus, but real, genuine, joyful laughter. Her father, in his own way, was proud of her. He never said it directly. That wasn't his style. But she saw it in the way he looked at her. The way he included her in his life. The way he made sure she had access to every resource she might need to heal and move forward. 3 months after Marcus's arrest, Victoria was sitting in her father's office. It was a beautiful day outside. The sun was shining. The city was alive with possibility. "You know what I realized?" she said to her father. "What's that?" he asked, looking up from his work. "I realized that the person I was when I was married to Marcus wasn't really me at all. It was a version of me that I created to survive. A version that was small and quiet and apologetic. But I'm not that person anymore. I don't think I ever want to be that person again." General Sterling smiled. "That's the first truly strong thing I've heard you say, Victoria, and I mean that. You're going to be fine. You're going to build a beautiful life. And you're going to help others do the same." Victoria nodded. She believed him. For the first time in 5 years, she believed in something other than pain and fear. She believed in herself. Chapter 4. The Fall. Marcus Ashford's trial was the event of the year. The courtroom was packed with journalists, photographers, and onlookers who wanted to witness the fall of a man who'd had everything. He'd hired the best lawyers money could buy, but even they couldn't save him. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's testimony was damning, and the jury didn't hesitate. They found him guilty on all counts. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Victoria one last time. His expression was filled with rage and disbelief, as if he still couldn't comprehend how this had happened, how he'd lost control of the narrative, how the woman he'd broken had somehow managed to put herself back together and use that strength against him. But that was the thing he'd never understood. Victoria wasn't broken. She was just waiting to remember who she was. And when she did, she became unstoppable. The sentencing hearing was the final act. The judge was a woman who'd clearly listened carefully to Victoria's testimony. She handed down a sentence of 15 years in prison. 15 years. The maximum the law allowed for his crimes. It wasn't justice. No amount of prison time could undo the damage he'd done. But it was consequences, it was accountability. It was a statement that his power, his money, his connections couldn't protect him from the law. Marcus was led away, and as he passed Victoria, he tried to grab her arm. The guards stopped him. He screamed her name. He screamed that she was ungrateful, that she would regret this, that he would find her no matter where she went. But his voice faded as they escorted him out of the courtroom. And Victoria felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just emptiness where the fear used to be, because she'd already moved on. She'd already reclaimed her life. Whatever happened to Marcus now was irrelevant. He was no longer a part of her story. Chapter 5. The Rebuilding. 6 months later, Victoria was a different woman. She'd gone back to school to study social work. She was working with an organization that helped women escape abusive situations. She was writing a book about her experience. And most importantly, she was learning how to live for herself, not for someone else, not to survive, but actually to live. Her father had encouraged her to take time off, to rest, to heal. But Victoria knew that rest wasn't what she needed. She needed purpose. She needed to take her pain and transform it into something meaningful, something that could help other people. One day, while she was working at the organization's office, a woman came in. She looked like Victoria used to look. Scared, bruised, lost, and Victoria knew exactly what to do. She took the woman's hand and said something she'd heard once and never forgot. "You are not broken. You are just remembering who you are." The woman started crying. And Victoria sat with her, holding her hand, listening to her story, and slowly guiding her toward the realization that she was strong enough to leave. This became Victoria's life. Not the penthouse, not the designer clothes, not the empty, hollow existence of being someone's possession. But this: connection, purpose, growth, healing. She also reconnected with her extended family. The people Marcus had convinced her had rejected her. They hadn't rejected her at all. They'd been waiting for her to come back. Waiting for her to realize that family didn't work that way. That real love didn't isolate. It supported. It encouraged. It lifted you up. Her mother had cried when she first saw Victoria after so many years. Real tears of joy and relief. And Victoria had cried with her. And slowly, piece by piece, she rebuilt the relationships that Marcus had destroyed. She learned that forgiveness wasn't something she had to do. She could be angry. She could be hurt. And she could still move forward. Some people in her life seemed to expect her to forgive Marcus, to find compassion for him somewhere in her heart. But Victoria had learned something important. Forgiveness was for her own sake, not his, and she wasn't ready to forgive. She might never be ready, but she could live without needing to forgive. She could just move on. 2 years after Marcus went to prison, Victoria ran into someone unexpected. William Henderson, the man she'd met at the party years ago. He was attending a fundraiser that Victoria's organization was hosting. When he saw her, his expression changed. "Victoria, I didn't realize you were involved with this organization. It's been too long." "Yes," she agreed, "it has." She expected him to ask questions, to reference her marriage to Marcus. But instead, he just smiled and said, "You've changed. You look like someone who's finally found what they were looking for." "Thank you," Victoria said, "I have." Chapter 6: The Closure. 5 years after Marcus's conviction, Victoria received a letter. It was from Marcus himself, forwarded through the prison. She almost didn't open it. She almost just threw it away. But something made her curious. She wanted to know what he could possibly have to say after all this time. The letter was long, rambling. In it, Marcus tried to explain himself. He talked about his childhood, his parents, his own insecurities that he'd projected onto her. He claimed that he'd never intended to hurt her, that he loved her, that she was the only woman he'd ever really wanted, and he begged her forgiveness. He begged her to wait for him, to be there when he got out of prison. He promised that he'd changed, that he'd done therapy, that he understood now how wrong he'd been. Victoria read the letter once. Then she burned it. She didn't respond. She didn't acknowledge it. Because she'd learned something important. Closure doesn't come from the other person. It comes from yourself. She didn't need Marcus to apologize for her to move on. She didn't need him to change for her to have a good life. She didn't need him at all. And that realization was more powerful than anything else could have been. Epilogue. Where they are now. Victoria Sterling is now the director of her organization. She's helped hundreds of women escape abusive situations. She's written a book that's become a bestseller. She speaks at universities and conferences about the psychology of abuse and the power of recovery. She's also found love again. Not with someone who controlled her, but with someone who supported her. Someone who saw her strength and admired it. Someone who wanted her to grow and thrive. Her father, General William Sterling, has since retired from the military. He spends his time mentoring young officers and spending time with his daughter. He's proud of her. He tells her that regularly now. They have a good relationship, a real relationship. Not one built on control or expectation, but on mutual respect and genuine love. Marcus Ashford remains in prison. He's had appeal after appeal denied. He's written dozens of letters that Victoria has refused to read. He's tried to contact her through different means, but she's moved on completely. He's a footnote in her story now, a chapter she's already finished reading. And the lesson that Victoria learned, the lesson that she shares with every woman who comes through her door, is simple but profound. You are not your abuse. You are not the names you've been called. You are not the version of yourself that someone else created. You are powerful. You are worthy. You are enough, just as you are. And the moment you believe that, truly believe it, you become unstoppable. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story of strength and recovery, please like and subscribe. The support means everything to me. And remember, if you're watching this and you're in a situation similar to Victoria's, there is help. There is hope. There is a way out. Please reach out to someone. A friend, a family member, a hotline. You don't have to endure this alone. And if you want your comment to appear in the next video, tell me in the comments below. Have you or anyone you know ever had to rebuild their life after a traumatic experience? What helped them move forward? I'm reading all the comments and your stories matter. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. But Victoria's journey didn't end there. What many people don't realize is that the process of rebuilding a life after trauma isn't linear. It's not a straight path from point A to point B. It's messy. It's complicated. It involves setbacks and unexpected challenges. And for Victoria Sterling, the real work was just beginning. 6 months after Marcus was sentenced, Victoria sat in her apartment, a modest place she'd chosen herself, decorated with her own taste, filled with things that made her happy rather than impressed guests, and she made a decision. She was going to start her organization officially. She had the resources, she had the drive, but more importantly, she had the lived experience that could genuinely help other women. The first thing she did was reach out to a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and domestic abuse. Victoria had found Dr. Chen's research while reading late one night, unable to sleep, seeking answers to the questions that still haunted her. Dr. Chen's work on the psychology of control and manipulation resonated with Victoria in ways she couldn't quite explain. It was like reading a map of her own mind, seeing her experiences validated through rigorous academic research. When Victoria called her, she didn't lead with her name or her family connections. She simply said, "I've read all your papers, I think we should work together." Dr. Chen, intrigued by the call and the certainty in this stranger's voice, agreed to meet. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. Victoria arrived early. She always arrived early now. It was a habit she developed during her marriage to Marcus. Showing up before him meant she could arrange things the way she wanted, could feel some small measure of control in spaces where control had been systematically taken from her. The habit had stuck, even though she no longer needed it. Dr. Chen was exactly as Victoria had imagined. Intelligent eyes, calm demeanor, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke. When Victoria began to tell her story, Dr. Chen didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply listened, took notes, and when Victoria finished, she said something that changed everything. "You understand the mechanics of abuse in a way that most survivors never do," Dr. Chen said. "Most people who have been through what you have are still in survival mode. But you're already analyzing it. That's rare. That's valuable. And if you want to help others, that perspective is exactly what we need." Together, they began to develop a comprehensive program. It wasn't just about providing shelter or legal resources, though those were important. It was about education. It was about helping women understand the patterns of abuse before they became trapped in them. It was about giving women the language to describe what was happening to them, because Victoria had learned that many abuse victims didn't even recognize what they were experiencing as abuse. They called the organization Sterling Foundation for Survivor Empowerment. Victoria wanted to reclaim her family name, to transform it from something that carried expectations and pressure into something that meant liberation and hope. The first women they helped were referred through local women's shelters and domestic violence hotlines. There was Maria, who had been married to a successful real estate developer who monitored every penny she spent. There was Jasmine, whose husband had gradually isolated her from her friends and family until she had no one to turn to. There was Rebecca, who had been convinced by her husband that she was too stupid to leave him, that she'd never survive on her own. Victoria worked with each of them individually, but she also established a group therapy component. She believed in the power of women hearing each other's stories. She believed in the validation that came from realizing you weren't alone, that what happened to you wasn't your fault, that your abuser's behavior wasn't a reflection of your worth. But the organization also brought unexpected complications into Victoria's life. There was the media attention, for one. Once word got out that the Victoria Sterling, daughter of General William Sterling, ex-wife of imprisoned billionaire Marcus Ashford, was running a nonprofit dedicated to helping abuse survivors, every newspaper and magazine wanted her story. Producers called, documentary filmmakers wanted to feature her work, publishers approached her about writing a memoir. Victoria was hesitant about all of it. She didn't want to be famous. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to do the work. But her father and Dr. Chen both encouraged her to think bigger. General Sterling, in particular, saw the strategic importance of raising awareness. "You have a platform now," he told her during one of their weekly dinners. "You can use it to help more people than you ever could working in the background. I know you don't want the attention. I know it feels uncomfortable. But comfort isn't the goal here. Impact is." He was right, though Victoria hated to admit it. When she did her first major interview with a national news outlet, discussing the patterns of abuse she'd observed, the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women reached out. The website crashed from the traffic. They received donations that would allow them to expand their work significantly, but with expansion came new challenges. Victoria had to learn how to manage staff. She had to learn how to delegate. She had to learn that she couldn't personally help every single person who reached out, no matter how much she wanted to. That was a difficult lesson. It triggered something in her, a guilt that felt similar to what she'd experienced during her marriage, that sense of never doing enough, of always falling short. It took several sessions with Dr. Chen to work through that guilt. To understand that it wasn't based in reality. That she was already doing more than most people ever would. That accepting her own limitations wasn't a failure, it was necessary for her to sustain the work long-term. Meanwhile, her personal life was evolving in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was a man named James who started volunteering at the organization. He was a social worker by training, but he'd taken time off work to help establish new support programs. Victoria noticed him first because of his patience with the women they served. He never tried to fix their problems. He just sat with them in their pain. He listened. He validated. He treated them with the kind of respect that Victoria had come to understand was shockingly rare. James was quiet. He didn't demand attention. He didn't need to be the center of every conversation. He asked questions about Victoria's work and actually listened to the answers. And most importantly, when Victoria would become frustrated or discouraged or overwhelmed, he didn't try to convince her that she was wrong to feel that way. He just said, "That sounds really hard. What do you need right now?" It took Victoria months to realize she was developing feelings for him. She almost self-sabotaged the relationship before it really began. She found reasons to doubt him. She looked for red flags that weren't there. She created tests to see if he would pass, because that's what she'd learned to do with Marcus, constantly testing, constantly vigilant, constantly preparing for disappointment. But James was patient with her suspicions. He didn't get defensive when she questioned his motives. He didn't pressure her to move faster than she was comfortable with. And slowly, Victoria began to believe that it was possible to have a relationship with someone who didn't need to control her. Someone who actually wanted her to be independent. Someone who saw her strength and was attracted to it rather than threatened by it. Her father noticed the shift before Victoria was ready to admit it to him. "You're different around him," General Sterling observed one evening when James had joined them for dinner. "More relaxed, more like yourself." "I'm still figuring out what myself means," Victoria replied. "After years of trying to be what Marcus wanted me to be, I'm still discovering who I actually am." "And who are you?" her father asked. Victoria thought about this question for a long time. "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted. "But I think I'm becoming someone who isn't defined by what happened to her. Someone who can hold what happened and still move forward. Someone who wants to help others do the same." As the organization grew, Victoria began to write. She started with journal entries, just processing her thoughts and experiences on paper. But Dr. Chen encouraged her to shape these thoughts into something more structured, something that could become a book. The writing process was grueling. Victoria had to revisit the most painful moments of her life and examine them closely enough to articulate them to strangers. She had to be honest about her own complicity in some ways, how she had rationalized his behavior, how she had made excuses for him, how she had tried to be better to make him happy. She had to own her part in the dynamic without losing sight of the fact that he was the one responsible for his choices. She also had to be careful about how she portrayed her father. General Sterling had never been abusive in the way Marcus was, but he had been controlling in his own way. He had made decisions for her. He had expected her to follow certain paths. He had used his power and authority to shape her life according to his vision. Writing about this meant having difficult conversations with her father. Conversations where she had to tell him that she felt controlled by him, even though she knew it came from a place of love and concern. It would have been easy for him to become defensive, but he didn't. He listened. He acknowledged that she was right, and then he asked her what he could do differently moving forward. That conversation changed their relationship fundamentally. It wasn't that they suddenly agreed on everything or that all tension disappeared, but there was a new honesty between them, a willingness to be vulnerable, a recognition that they both had work to do, him in learning to let go of control, her in learning to not internalize that control as love. The book, titled Breaking Free: How I Survived Control and Found Myself, was published 3 years after Victoria's divorce was finalized. It spent 12 weeks on the bestseller list. More importantly, it resonated deeply with readers. Victoria received thousands of letters and emails from women who said the book had given them permission to leave their own abusive relationships. Some said it had saved their lives. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a woman named Michelle, who had been married to a man who operated exactly like Marcus. Controlling, manipulative, charming in public. She'd read Victoria's book and recognized herself and her husband in the pages. She'd used the resources Victoria provided to reach out to a local shelter. She'd left. She'd rebuilt her life. And now she was 3 years out and thriving. "Your book gave me permission to trust my own perceptions," Michelle wrote. "I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that he wasn't that bad, that I should be grateful for what he provided. Reading your story made me realize that this is what abuse victims do. We minimize, we rationalize, we blame ourselves. Your courage to tell your story gave me courage to reclaim mine." Victoria read that letter dozens of times. She framed it. She put it on the wall of her office at the foundation. Because on the days when the work felt overwhelming, when another woman came through the door with the same trapped look Victoria had worn, when she questioned whether any of this mattered, that letter reminded her why she was doing this. The work was having an impact. The organization was able to help hundreds of women annually. They had a network of housing resources, legal advocates, therapists, and job training programs. They worked with law enforcement to better understand and respond to domestic abuse cases. They went into schools and communities to educate people about the warning signs of abusive relationships. But Victoria also became aware of something darker. There were other men like Marcus out there. Wealthy men who used their resources to silence their victims. Men whose crimes never made it to court because they hired the best lawyers and intimidated witnesses into silence. Men whose abuse continued because the system was designed to protect their assets more than it protected their victims. This realization led Victoria down a new path. She began to work with prosecutors and law enforcement, using her unique insight into how wealthy abusers operated to help bring cases that might otherwise have fallen through the cracks. She became an expert witness in several high-profile cases, testifying about the patterns and tactics of controlling partners. It was during this work that she met Detective Sarah Williams, a driven investigator in the Major Crimes Division who had become passionate about bringing abusers to justice. Sarah had read Victoria's book and had been fascinated by how accurately Victoria had described the psychological mechanisms of abuse. When Sarah reached out to ask if Victoria would consult on a particularly difficult case, Victoria said yes without hesitation. The case involved a woman named Angela who had been hospitalized multiple times with accidents that her husband claimed were her own fault: a fall down the stairs, a car accident, a kitchen injury. Each incident was plausibly deniable, but Sarah's instincts told her something darker was happening. Victoria reviewed the case files and knew immediately what she was looking at. This was textbook intimate partner violence with escalating severity. The husband was a surgeon with significant social standing and connections. He had convinced Angela that no one would believe her if she tried to leave. He had isolated her from her family. He had convinced her that she was lucky to have him, that no one else would want her. The investigation was complicated and required careful handling. But with Victoria's insights into the psychological profile of the abuser and her understanding of how these cases are often mishandled, Sarah was able to build a solid case. Evidence was gathered, witnesses were interviewed, and eventually, Angela was able to leave and file charges. The trial was difficult. The husband's legal team was aggressive and well-funded. They attacked Angela's credibility. They suggested she was mentally unstable. They presented alternative explanations for her injuries. But Victoria's testimony about the patterns of abuse, about how controlling partners systematically undermine their victims' sense of reality, was crucial. The jury believed Angela. The husband was convicted. After the trial, Angela came to Victoria's office. She was a different woman than the one who had first reached out. She had color in her cheeks. She stood taller. She made eye contact. And she thanked Victoria not just for testifying, but for believing her. "You know what the hardest part was?" Angela asked. "It wasn't the physical pain. It was that I had stopped believing in myself. I thought I was crazy. I thought I was making things up. But when I heard you describe exactly what I was experiencing, it was like permission to trust myself again, permission to believe that I wasn't the problem." That conversation stuck with Victoria, because she realized that one of the most insidious aspects of abuse is that it makes victims doubt their own reality. And one of the most powerful tools for recovery is simply being believed. Having someone else look at what happened and say, "Yes, that was abuse. You were right to recognize it as such. You are not crazy." This realization shaped the next phase of Victoria's work. She began training other professionals, therapists, lawyers, judges, police officers, about the nuances of abuse and how to properly respond to victims. She created educational materials. She consulted on policy changes. She became, in many ways, a voice for people who had been silenced. But this work also brought her into conflict with powerful people. There was pushback from some in the legal community who felt she was biased against men. There were criticisms that she was making assumptions based on her own experience. There were threats from men who felt that her work had endangered them by making it harder for them to control their partners without legal consequences. One particularly disturbing incident occurred when a man who had been convicted of abuse after Victoria's testimony showed up at the foundation's office. Security stopped him before he could get far, but the message was clear. Victoria's work was making her enemies, people who wanted to harm her to silence her advocacy. General Sterling was furious when he found out. He wanted to assign security to her. He wanted to move her to a more secure location. But Victoria refused. She wouldn't let fear drive her away from the work she believed in. She wouldn't give abusers and their sympathizers the satisfaction of knowing they had intimidated her. Instead, she worked with law enforcement to increase security at the foundation. She took self-defense classes, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to reclaim her sense of agency and control over her own safety. And she continued her work, more determined than ever. It was around this time that Victoria realized she was in love with James. It wasn't a lightning bolt moment. It was quiet and certain, like coming home. He had been there through all of it: the expansion of the organization, the book launch, the difficult court cases, the threats. He had supported her without trying to protect her from her own work. He had celebrated her victories and sat with her through her challenges. When she told him she loved him, his response was characteristically simple. "I know," he said. "I've loved you for a long time. I was just waiting for you to figure out that you could love me back without losing yourself." They got married on a small beach in Washington, with only their closest friends and family present. There were no white lace and expectations. Victoria wore a simple cream-colored dress that she loved, not because it was traditional, but because it made her feel beautiful. James wore a suit that fit him well. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises not to complete each other, but to support each other in becoming more fully themselves. General Sterling cried, though he would later deny it if asked. He danced with Victoria and told her he was proud of her, not because of who she'd married or what position she'd achieved, but because of who she had become. A woman who had survived something that could have destroyed her and had instead used that experience to help others. As Victoria's reputation grew, she began to receive invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and organizations around the country. She talked about the psychology of abuse, She talked about recovery. She talked about the systemic changes that needed to happen to better protect abuse victims. And everywhere she spoke, women approached her afterward with their own stories. Stories that broke her heart and inspired her simultaneously. But one particular speaking engagement would lead to something Victoria hadn't anticipated. She had been invited to speak at a conference on gender-based violence at Stanford University. The audience included academics, activists, law enforcement, and policymakers. It was the kind of venue where Victoria could talk about the deeper issues, not just individual cases, but systemic problems. During the Q&A session after her talk, a man raised his hand. He was an older gentleman, distinguished-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Victoria recognized him immediately. He was Senator David Hartwell, a powerful politician who had been in the news recently for his work on legislation related to domestic violence prevention. His question was thoughtful and genuine. In your experience, what is the single biggest barrier to women leaving abusive relationships? Victoria considered the question carefully. Fear, she said finally, not just fear of their partner's violence, though that's certainly part of it, but fear of economic devastation, fear of losing custody of their children, fear of homelessness, fear of starting over, fear of the unknown. And underneath all of that, fear that they've internalized from their abuser, fear that they're not capable of surviving without them, fear that they're too damaged, fear that they deserve what's happened to them. The senator nodded thoughtfully. And what would help address those fears? Resources, Victoria said. Shelters and housing assistance, legal support, job training and employment assistance, counseling and mental health services. And most fundamentally, a society that believes victims when they come forward. That values their safety more than the reputation or resources of their abuser. After the conference, Senator Hartwell approached Victoria. He wanted to talk about policy. He was working on legislation that would strengthen protections for abuse victims. He wanted to include some of the evidence-based approaches that Victoria's organization had pioneered. He wanted her input. What started as a conversation became a collaboration. Victoria found herself traveling to Washington, D.C., meeting with legislators, testifying before committees, helping to shape policy that would affect millions of people. It was heady work, and it was gratifying in a way that individual cases, while important, could never quite match. She was helping to change the system itself. But this work also required Victoria to confront some uncomfortable truths about her father. General Sterling had connections in Washington. He had relationships with many of the same people Victoria was now working with. And some of those relationships had been complicated times when he had prioritized military interests over individual rights, times when he had supported policies that hurt vulnerable people. Victoria didn't shy away from these conversations. She asked her father directly about his voting record, his positions, his past decisions. Some of those conversations were tense, but they were honest. And through them, Victoria and her father developed a deeper understanding of each other, not as symbols or roles, but as complex human beings trying to do the right thing, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. "I'm not the same man I was when you were growing up," General Sterling told her during one of these conversations. "Your strength, your willingness to do hard things, your refusal to let what happened to you define you, it's changed me. Made me think about power differently, about what it means to actually use power responsibly." Years passed. The organization continued to grow. The foundation that had started in Victoria's apartment was now a network of facilities across multiple states. Thousands of women had been helped, dozens of abusers had been prosecuted successfully, policies had been changed, laws had been strengthened, but Victoria never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the woman she had been when she was married to Marcus, the one who had twisted herself into pretzels trying to be what he wanted, who had lost herself so completely that she barely remembered who she was. She carried that memory with her as fuel for her work. And she made sure that every woman who came through the doors of the Sterling Foundation knew one thing above all else: that their abuse wasn't their fault. That they were not responsible for their abuser's behavior. That they were worthy of love and respect exactly as they were. That recovery wasn't about becoming someone different, it was about becoming more fully themselves. and that the strength it took to survive an abusive relationship was the same strength they would need to build a new life. Because Victoria had learned that abuse doesn't just happen in a moment. It's a process. A slow erosion of self, a gradual rewriting of reality, a systematic dismantling of confidence and autonomy. But recovery, real recovery, wasn't a moment either. It was a process too. A slow reclamation of self, a gradual rebuilding of reality as it actually was, a systematic restoration of confidence and autonomy. Every woman Victoria worked with had to find her own path through that process. But Victoria could light the way. She could say, "I've been where you are, I know how dark it feels, I know how impossible it seems. And I'm here to tell you that there is light on the other side. There is a way out. And the person you become on the other side of this will be stronger, more authentic, more truly yourself than you ever imagined possible." And it was this promise, this unwavering commitment to lighting the way, that would define Victoria's life for the next 15 years. The Sterling Foundation grew in ways that surprised even Victoria herself. What had started as a grassroots operation, run from a modest office space with a skeleton crew of volunteers, had transformed into a nationally recognized institution. Major donors began to take notice. Celebrities started lending their platforms. Universities requested partnership agreements. The foundation's name became synonymous with survivor advocacy, with accountability, with systemic change. But success brought its own complications. Around the 10-year mark, Victoria found herself navigating a world she hadn't anticipated. The foundation was now so large, so visible, that it had become a target for scrutiny from multiple directions. Critics on one side argued that the organization was too aggressive in its prosecution efforts, that it was rushing to judgment before all the facts were in. Others claimed that the foundation wasn't doing enough, that it was too focused on legal accountability and not enough on prevention. Political groups tried to co-opt the organization's message to serve their own agendas. Religious organizations offered support that came with strings attached, with the expectation that survivors would forgive their abusers as part of the healing process. Victoria had to make difficult decisions about which partnerships to accept and which to refuse. She had to develop a thick skin against criticism while still remaining open to genuine feedback. She had to learn the difference between people who wanted to help and people who wanted to use the foundation's work as a platform for their own beliefs. One afternoon, seated in her office, which was now on the 23rd floor of a building in downtown Washington, D.C., Victoria received a visitor who challenged everything she thought she understood about the work she was doing. The woman's name was Diane Richardson, and she had been one of Marcus's victims. Victoria didn't recognize the name at first. The foundation worked with thousands of women, and while Victoria tried to know as many of them personally as possible, it was an impossible task. But Diane had requested a private meeting, and Victoria's assistant flagged it as important. When the woman arrived, Victoria saw immediately why. Diane was flanked by 2 lawyers and carried with her a thick folder of documents. "Thank you for seeing me," Diane said, settling into the chair across from Victoria's desk. "Of course," Victoria replied, though she felt a flutter of unease. She had learned to recognize the difference between a survivor seeking support and someone seeking something else entirely. Diane's posture, her clipped tone, the way her jaw was set, these suggested a very different kind of conversation. "I've been following the foundation's work," Diane began. "I've seen the cases you've prosecuted, the policies you've changed, the women you've helped, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for that. Truly. But I'm also here because I have a problem with how my case has been handled." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what happened." What followed was a complicated story. Diane had been married to Marcus for 7 years, overlapping with Victoria's marriage to him by 4 of those years. She had suffered physical abuse, emotional manipulation, and financial control. She had come forward to the Sterling Foundation 5 years earlier, and the foundation had helped her build a case against Marcus that resulted in a criminal conviction on assault charges and a civil settlement. "The problem," Diane said, "is what happened after." She opened the folder and slid documents across the desk. Photographs, court records, emails, text messages. As Victoria reviewed them, the story became clear. After Marcus's conviction, his legal team had launched a counteroffensive. They had dug into Diane's past and found ammunition, a history of substance abuse, a custody dispute with a previous partner, allegations that she had made false claims in a prior relationship. Marcus's lawyers had presented this information to the court during sentencing, and it had been used to minimize his punishment. He had received a reduced sentence based on what his defense team characterized as the unreliability of the accuser. "We won the case," Diane said bitterly. "We got the conviction, but then we lost everything that mattered. His sentence was cut in half. He'll be out in 5 years instead of 10. And every day in court, I felt like I was the one on trial, not him." Victoria listened carefully, and as she did, she felt the familiar weight of moral complexity settling over her shoulders. This was the part of the work that didn't make it into the Foundation's promotional materials, the part that kept her awake at night. "I wanted to ask you," Diane continued, "whether the Foundation is prepared to support survivors through the entire process, not just the prosecution, but what comes after. Because I feel like we're promised accountability, but what we get is a hollow victory where the abuser's lawyers get to tear apart our lives in court and somehow convince a judge that our trauma makes us unreliable witnesses to our own abuse." It was a fair criticism, and it was one that Victoria had been thinking about for months. "Diane, I want to apologize for how you've been treated through this process," Victoria said carefully. "You're right that we can do better. And I want to tell you that we're already working on improvements to how we support survivors through the legal process. But I also want to be honest with you, and I think you deserve honesty. There are no perfect solutions here. The legal system has fundamental problems that are bigger than any individual organization." "I know that," Diane replied, "but that's not the same as doing nothing about the problems that you can solve." Over the next several months, Victoria and Diane worked together to develop a new program within the Sterling Foundation. It was called the Survivor Advocacy and Legal Support Initiative, and its purpose was to prepare survivors not just for prosecution, but for the counterassault that defense teams would launch against them. The program included mock cross-examinations, psychological preparation, media training, and financial support for the lengthy legal process. It meant that the Foundation had to hire additional lawyers and victim advocates. It meant increasing the organization's budget significantly, but it also meant that survivors like Diane wouldn't face the courtroom alone and unprepared. As Victoria threw herself into this new work, she began to notice something else happening in her personal life. Her father, General Sterling, was aging. He was still vibrant and engaged, still wielding considerable influence, but he was no longer the imposing figure of Victoria's childhood. He moved a little more slowly. He tired more easily. He had started to talk about legacy, about what he wanted to leave behind. One evening, Victoria visited her father's home in Arlington, a stately mansion that had been in the Sterling family for 3 generations. They sat in his study, surrounded by photographs and memoirs and awards, and General Sterling asked Victoria a question that caught her off guard. "Do you ever resent me," he asked, "for not being there? For not knowing what was happening to you?" Victoria considered the question carefully. It was not the first time her father had asked it, but the way he asked it now suggested that he needed a different kind of answer than she had given before. "Not anymore," she said finally. "I did resent you for a long time. I resented you for being absent. I resented you for building a career that seemed more important to you than your family. I resented you for raising me to value strength and independence in a way that made it harder for me to admit when I was vulnerable. But resentment is a weight you carry, and at some point, I realized that carrying it wasn't hurting you, it was only hurting me." General Sterling nodded slowly. "That's wise," he said, "and I want to tell you something. When I look back at my career, at the decisions I made, at the priorities I had, I'm not proud of all of it. I made choices that prioritized ambition over presence. I modeled a certain kind of strength that was really just a way of avoiding vulnerability. And the irony is that you learned a different kind of strength from your suffering. You learned how to be strong in your brokenness. You learned how to help other people be strong in theirs. You became something that I never could have been, even if I had tried." "Dad," Victoria said gently, "you don't have to." "I need to," he interrupted. "I need you to know that I see what you've built, not just the foundation, though that's remarkable, but what you've built inside yourself. That's what I'm proud of, that's what matters. After that conversation, something shifted in Victoria's relationship with her father. It became less about reconciliation and more about mutual respect between two people who had lived difficult lives and come to different conclusions about what those lives meant. Around this same time, Victoria was approached by a film producer named Elena Vasquez, who wanted to make a documentary about the Sterling Foundation and Victoria's story. Elena had extensive experience making films about social issues and had won multiple awards for her work. She was not interested in creating a hagiography. Instead, she wanted to tell the full, complicated story, the successes and the failures, the moral ambiguities, the messy reality of trying to create systemic change. Victoria's instinct was to say no. She had become increasingly skeptical of the way her story was often presented in the media, as a simple narrative of triumph over adversity, as though surviving abuse and then working to help others was a straightforward path from darkness to light. The truth was far more complicated, far messier, far more interesting than that. But Alina was persistent, and eventually Victoria agreed to a series of conversations. What began as an interview process became something more like a collaboration. Alina spent weeks inside the Sterling Foundation, observing the work, talking to staff members and survivors, attending board meetings and community events. She watched Victoria in moments of triumph and moments of profound doubt. There was one scene in particular that Alina captured that would end up being central to the documentary. Victoria was facilitating a survivor support group, which she did once a month despite her increasingly demanding schedule. There were 6 women in the group that evening, at various stages of their healing journeys. One of them, a woman named Angela, was describing the moment when she finally left her abusive partner. "I was terrified," Angela said. "I knew that leaving was the right thing to do, but I was so terrified. And I kept thinking about all the reasons to stay. He could change. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was responsible for his behavior. All these thoughts that I had been trained to think over years of abuse. And then I thought about something Victoria once said. She said that leaving an abusive relationship isn't about being brave. It's about deciding that you're worth protecting. And I realized that I was worth protecting. Not because anyone else said so. Not because someone would rescue me. But because I'm a human being, and human beings deserve to be treated with respect." As Angela spoke, Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Alina's camera captured the moment when Victoria reached across and squeezed Angela's hand, when she whispered something to her that the camera couldn't hear. Later, when Alina reviewed the footage, she asked Victoria what she had said. "I told her she was right," Victoria replied. "And I told her that she had just done the hardest thing anyone can do. She had decided that her own life was worth something." The documentary took 2 years to complete. During that time, Victoria continued to run the foundation, continued to evolve the programs, continued to navigate the increasingly complex world of advocacy work in a polarized political environment. The foundation had become so large, so influential, that it had enemies as well as allies. Conservative groups accused it of being anti-male. Religious groups accused it of being anti-family. Some progressive activists accused it of being too focused on individual recovery and not enough on systemic oppression. Law enforcement agencies sometimes viewed the foundation's work as interference in their investigations. Victoria found herself constantly having to articulate and defend her vision for what the foundation should be. And in doing so, she developed a clearer and clearer understanding of her own philosophy. "We're not anti-man," she would say in response to critics. "We're anti-abuse. We believe that abuse is a choice, and that the people who choose to abuse others should face consequences for those choices. But we also believe that most people are capable of change. We believe in accountability, not vengeance. We believe in holding people responsible while also believing that redemption is possible." It was a position that satisfied no one completely. But it was, Victoria believed, the most honest position she could take. In the 13th year of the foundation's existence, Victoria received an unexpected visitor at her office. It was Marcus's mother, Eleanor Westbrook. Victoria hadn't seen Eleanor in more than 2 decades. She was older now, more frail, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that Victoria remembered. I hope you'll give me a moment, Eleanor said. She was not asking permission so much as gently asserting her right to it. Victoria gestured to the chair across from her desk. Of course, please sit. Eleanor settled herself carefully. She was carrying a cane now, though Victoria suspected it was more habit than necessity. I've come to tell you something, Eleanor began. I've come to tell you that my son is a deeply troubled man, and that his actions toward you and toward the other women in his life were inexcusable. I've come to tell you that I failed him as a mother, that I raised him with a sense of entitlement, and a lack of empathy that allowed him to believe that his desires superseded other people's autonomy. And I've come to tell you that I'm grateful for the work you've done. Victoria felt something in her chest constrict. She had expected many things from this encounter, but not this. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because I'm dying, Eleanor said simply. I have maybe 6 months, and I don't want to leave this world without acknowledging the harm my son caused and thanking the person who has spent her life trying to prevent that harm from happening to others. Eleanor stayed for nearly 3 hours. She told Victoria stories about Marcus's childhood, about the ways that entitlement had been cultivated in him from an early age, about her own complicity in his development. She talked about her visits to see him in prison, about his lack of remorse, about the way he still blamed his victims for his behavior. He will never change, Eleanor said. He will die in prison, and he will go to his grave believing that he was the victim. That is the tragedy of his life, not that he is in prison, but that he has made it impossible for himself to ever know the truth about what he did. After Eleanor left, Victoria sat in her office for a long time. She thought about the interconnectedness of trauma, about how the damage that Marcus had caused rippled out in multiple directions, not just to his victims, but to his mother, who had to live with her own complicity in his damage. She thought about how the work she did was not just about holding abusers accountable, but about breaking the cycles that created them in the first place. That evening, she called her father. I need to talk to you about something, she said. General Sterling heard the weight in her voice and said, Tell me. Victoria described Eleanor's visit, described her own reflections on how trauma and entitlement became intertwined. And then she asked her father a question that she had been carrying for years. Do you think that Marcus could have become a different person? If circumstances had been different, if someone had intervened earlier, if his mother had raised him differently, do you think he could have been someone who loved well instead of someone who hurt? General Sterling was quiet for a long moment. I think, he said finally, that at some point, every person has to take responsibility for who they become. You can have compassion for the circumstances that shaped them without absolving them of the choices they made. Your ex-husband became who he is because of choices he made, repeatedly, over many years. Some of those choices were influenced by the way he was raised, by his family dynamics, by his privilege and entitlement. But they were still choices. And the fact that we can understand why he made those choices doesn't mean we have to accept them as inevitable. But what about prevention? Victoria pressed. What if we could identify people like him earlier? What if we could intervene in families where this kind of entitlement is being cultivated? That's the work, General Sterling said. That's the work that goes beyond accountability. That's the work that prevents the next Marcus Westbrook from ever existing in the first place. It was this conversation that sparked the next evolution of the Sterling Foundation's work. Victoria began developing educational programs that would be implemented in schools, in youth organizations, in community centers. The programs focused on healthy relationships, on consent, on empathy, on the recognition that other people's autonomy was not negotiable. They focused on helping young people, particularly young men, develop a different kind of strength, one that was rooted in respect for others rather than dominance over them. The programs faced resistance, of course. Some parents objected to what they perceived as a radical agenda. Some religious groups claimed that the programs were undermining family values. Some conservative politicians argued that the programs were unfairly targeting boys and making them feel ashamed of their masculinity. But the research began to show something interesting. Schools that implemented the Sterling Foundation's curriculum showed measurable decreases in incidents of sexual harassment and dating violence. Young people who went through the programs reported higher levels of empathy and better conflict resolution skills. And perhaps most importantly, the programs created spaces where young men could talk about masculinity in a different way, not as domination, not as the ability to overcome others, but as the capacity to be strong in relationships, to show up with integrity, to respect the autonomy of others. It was slow, incremental work, but it was work that Victoria increasingly believed was the most important work the Foundation could do. By the time the documentary was released, the Sterling Foundation had evolved far beyond what Victoria had originally envisioned. It was no longer just about prosecution and survivor support, though those remained central to its mission. It had become a comprehensive organization that worked at every level, at the level of individual healing, at the level of legal accountability, at the level of systemic change, and at the level of prevention and education. The documentary, which Elena titled The Weight of Strength, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. It received critical acclaim not for presenting Victoria as a hero, but for presenting her as a complex human being navigating impossible terrain. It showed her moments of doubt and uncertainty. It showed her disagreements with her own staff. It showed her struggling with the limitations of what any one organization could accomplish. But it also showed something else. It showed the transformative impact of her work. It showed women rebuilding their lives, finding their voice, discovering their worth. It showed communities that had been changed by the Foundation's presence. It showed a system beginning, slowly, incrementally, to shift toward accountability and healing. After the premiere, Victoria gave an interview to a major magazine. The interviewer asked her a question that seemed simple, but that actually went to the heart of everything she had been doing for the past 15 years. Do you consider yourself a success? Victoria